All right, we're going to go ahead and get started here. Thanks again, everyone, for joining me for today's webinar. Today's session will focus on the Knowify and QuickBooks Desktop integration. So the idea between the sync between Knowify and QuickBooks, it's definitely useful in the sense that it avoids the need for any kind of double entry. What I mean by that is Knowify is designed specifically to manage your projects and everything that goes into those projects. So being able to job cost, labor, materials, and subcontractors, being able to progress invoice, quote customers, and just keep in touch with everybody in the field as they log their time as well. Knowify keeps track of that, while QuickBooks is still your primary point of entry for anything accounting related. And when you integrate Knowify and QuickBooks, this doesn't necessarily have to change. The idea is that anything job related that's going to affect the books in accounts receivable or accounts payable, Knowify will automatically sync to QuickBooks for you. And then anything logged in QuickBooks that's eligible in Knowify, such as any new customers or vendors, any payments on invoices or bills created in Knowify, things like that will sync directly back into Knowify. So you're able to effectively manage your projects in Knowify and continue managing your accounting in QuickBooks without needing to enter things in two different places. Yesterday was our webinar on the QuickBooks Online integration. This is what Knowify was built with in mind, and we have our integration a lot longer with the online version, but we're pleased to announce that this year we've been able to build an integration with the desktop version. So it's not as automatic as the online because we're still syncing cloud-based software and Knowify with desktop software. However, we do have a sync agent we built so that we can automatically transfer data back and forth and just make things easier on you if you're continuing to use QuickBooks Desktop. So just a quick intro. If you haven't met me before, my name is Vincent. I'm a product expert here at Knowify. And I work a lot with the team on the QuickBooks Desktop integration. So if you already have an account with us or interested in QuickBooks Desktop integrating with Knowify in the future, there's a good chance we'll get a chance to work together as well. So what we'll be covering today, and just want to go over the basics of how the integration works and show you an example of that as well. We will start by walking through the onboarding process. It requires a little bit more setup when we're getting started as opposed to the online integration where you could just log in and connect. This connection is required so that we can authorize Knowify and QuickBooks to send and receive data from one another. This is usually done in a screen share onboarding session. So myself and our team, we walk through this process with you every step of the way, and we do not leave you until we can make sure that everything is working properly. So we'll go through that process a bit. Also want to cover what syncs back and forth between QuickBooks and Knowify. The primary things that we built for the online integration are still very much in play here. So the basics like our invoicing, our customers, vendors, item lists, payments, things like that will still sync back and forth. But just want to make sure I cover any differences between our online integration and just give you a better idea of what is going to go back and forth. And before we walk through an example of syncing from Knowify to QuickBooks and QuickBooks to Knowify, we'll walk through setting up the default accounts for mapping data. And what this is instead of us just sending data to QuickBooks and dumping it off so that it's handled there, we are able to map over the default chart of accounts to use so that when we push over an invoice or a bill or anything that's going to hit our accounts receivable or accounts payable, we can set up in Knowify which of those general ledger accounts we want to use for different pieces of information. So not only does Knowify sync the data to QuickBooks, it also makes sure that it hits the right place once it gets to QuickBooks. Again, the idea of the sync is to try to remove as much extra work as possible so that this integration makes your life easier and definitely makes it easier on the tandems where we have our accountants working in QuickBooks and our project managers in Knowify. It helps keep the balance between those two. All right, so we'll start off here with the demonstration. I will leave some time at the end. So after we cover the basics, we'll open it up for Q&A. And if you have any questions as I'm going through it, we'll save some time and go through them at the end, but you can submit questions at any time by clicking the Q&A box in your Zoom window. That'll let you submit a question that we can cover later. All right, so before I jump in and show you the actual integration in the QuickBooks account, I just want to cover what specifically is going to sync back and forth with QuickBooks Desktop. We can link you to this page here as a reference going forward, but just to give you a better idea, the best way to use this is Knowify as the primary point of entry for anything job related, while QuickBooks is still going to be your place to manage anything accounting related. Things like your customers, vendors, and your products and service list, this is part of the bidirectional sync. So whether you log them in Knowify or in QuickBooks, it'll automatically transfer to the other side. These are obviously important entities that need to be available on both ends. So that is part of the two-way sync. Now, accounts, classes, and employees, this is not managed in Knowify, but you will have places, and we'll walk through them, where you can set up the default mapping for accounts and classes. So we do pull these in for you so that you can choose them when you're assigning them to different jobs or customers or vendors. But it's not managed in Knowify. So you wouldn't necessarily add or run reports on your chart of accounts in Knowify. That's still primarily a QuickBooks task. Now, invoices, this is referring to invoices for customers. These need to be logged in Knowify. We don't pull in these invoices from QuickBooks into Knowify. The reason is that each invoice in Knowify needs to be logged specifically against a contract or service job in Knowify. So it's specific to our system. They need to be created in Knowify. With that being said, you'll see as just a little bit lower, payments go in both directions. So a very common flow that we see is the invoice created for the job in Knowify, sync to QuickBooks, and then on the QuickBooks side, we can record payment or process payment there, and Knowify will automatically pull that back in. So the payments go in both directions, but the invoices themselves only go from Knowify to QuickBooks. The same thing here for vendor invoices, which are referred to as bills in Knowify, or if we have any kind of vendor credits. These need to be logged in Knowify and synced to QuickBooks. We are in the process of expanding this to include credit card charges so that you will be able to sync over a credit card expense from Knowify to QuickBooks and then match that expense to your credit card's bank feed in QuickBooks. This is something we already have built for the online version, and it will be coming soon for the desktop version. At this point in time, the only expenses that will sync from Knowify to QuickBooks are when we create a vendor bill, or if we create a purchase and we choose that it was paid with cash or a debit card. That's because that's essentially an expense that's telling Knowify that we're paying for it up front, so we're not waiting for an invoice later. Those will sync directly to QuickBooks along with the vendor invoices as well. Now, tax items, and also kind of lump in payment terms with this. It's very similar to the accounts and classes in number 4 in that we're not managing them in Knowify. We're giving you the choice of what you have in QuickBooks. So Knowify will detect your tax items and payment terms. We will pull them in for you so that you can choose them as your defaults and use them when you're creating invoices and contracts. But this is, again, you're managing that specifically in QuickBooks. Knowify is just making it available to you for your jobs in Knowify. And the last part is the jobs. These are treated as sub-customers. So if you have jobs set up as sub-customers already in QuickBooks, Knowify will pull it in as a sub-customer and you can then convert it to a job. On the contrary, when you create a new job in Knowify, it will sync it over to QuickBooks as a sub-customer. While this is typically optional with the online version, this is a requirement for the desktop version so that when we do log expenses and invoices for these jobs, we can ensure that they do make it to QuickBooks and they're synced to the correct place. It also gives you more options for reporting when you're checking out the jobs on the QuickBooks side, because while you still want to manage your projects in Knowify, and we'll give you more in the way of job tracking, this is still a way for you to isolate the job from just the regular parent client and be able to run reports accordingly. So that's the basics of what syncs back and forth. I'm going to go ahead and switch my screen share here um, and pull up an example of how our QuickBooks desktop integration looks. All right, so at this point, you should be able to see my screen here. I have Knowify up in our Chrome window, have QuickBooks Desktop in the background, we'll get to that, and also our sync agent here, and I'll get to this shortly as well. So in Knowify, you'll see that on the dashboard, once you're connected with QuickBooks Desktop, we'll have this dashboard card added automatically so that we can at a glance check our status and sync with QuickBooks at any point. When I see this as connected and connected, this lets me know that the sync agent and the QuickBooks file is up and running, and anything I sync right now is going to make it across and vice versa from QuickBooks into Knowify. Before we get there, I'd just like to walk through the process of onboarding, just to give you a better idea of what it entails as far as setting up your Knowify account to sync with QuickBooks Desktop. So it'll be very similar in that in your admin section under the QuickBooks tab, we will enable the desktop integration. So there will be a list of 4 steps here. And the first step is to download Knowify Sync Manager. That is what I'm pulling up here on the right. And this is where the difference starts to come in as far as our integration with online and with desktop versions of QuickBooks. In order for us to sync to the desktop version, we need this Knowify sync agent to be running in the background at all times. This is what we use to authorize the connection, and this facilitates the sending and receiving of data between Knowify and QuickBooks. It's not intrusive in any way, and you can always exit out here, and it will be available and still running in the background down here at the bottom right. But this needs to be running when you start your computer or server or remote desktop in order for us to be able to sync. So that's a very important part of it. The other part that's different is you have to initiate the sync. It's rather than it being automatic, we have a queue in Knowify. So whenever you finalize something that's eligible to sync, it'll be put on hold and stored in a central location. And then you'll have a sync with QuickBooks button that'll send anything in the queue from Knowify to QuickBooks, and it'll also check QuickBooks and pull in any recent updates to Knowify. We'll get to there shortly. So at this point, we start off by enabling the integration. We download the sync manager, that's step 1. Step 2 is to copy in this code. This is a unique code for your account, and this just helps us link your Knowify account to your QuickBooks account. Basically, we copy this code and paste it into this sync manager, and that's the extent of what you need this sync manager for. It's nothing crazy here. We just make sure that the code is lined up. It'll show the status as being logged in and connected. And then whenever we pull data or send data to QuickBooks, this sync agent will start working for us. The last step will be to establish connection with Sync Manager. And in order to do this, you need to have your QuickBooks file in single user mode and logged in as the admin. This is just for the initial connection. Once you're connected with QuickBooks, you are able to use it in multi-user mode and sync without issue. But for the initial connection, we need to be in single user mode as the admin. And once I click the Establish Connection with QuickBooks button, which is the last step here on the setup, Knowify is going to pop up a certificate here in QuickBooks. And basically, it's going to ask us if we want to allow Knowify to sync to QuickBooks, even if it's not running, and just authorizing that as the admin. It's basically just allowing the connection to happen. And once we save that, you'll be able to find it in your preferences in QuickBooks under integrated applications in the company preferences. This is just letting us know applications that previously requested access to this file. On your side, you only have one. This is our test account, so we've tested several managers here, but you'll just have one that says Sync Manager for Knowify, and just letting us know that the details here and that we have access to send and receive data without actually having QuickBooks running. And once that's set up, that's basically all you need to do. to enable the integration. And like I said, we do set up a screen share session. So, we'll walk through this process up until this point. And then at this point, Knowify will start to pull in your list of customers, vendors, and products and services. So at that point, it could take a couple minutes depending on the size of your QuickBooks file and how many of these lists that you have. But essentially, we take it from that point, pull in all of the relevant data into Knowify, and that'll bring us to the next step, which is to set our defaults. So once I'm connected to QuickBooks, after we make that initial connection, I now have my dashboard card here that I can see at a glance I'm connected. And also, if I click more at the bottom left here, and then the QuickBooks tab, this will take me to my accountant section. And this is where I can further keep track of information going back and forth between Knowify and QuickBooks, and also set up the default mapping of data. So at this point, I can see the transactions log here, and this will show me everything that's synced back and forth between Knowify and QuickBooks. I can see where it came from, what it was, when it synced, and that it was complete without an error. And you'll see that this section here becomes our queue as well. And I'll show you that when we do finalize like a new invoice or a new job, something like that, you'll see an entry here that says on hold, so that when I'm ready, I can click this Sync with QuickBooks button, and this will automatically start sending the data to QuickBooks, and it'll ask us if we want to check QuickBooks for any recent data to pull back into Knowify. Now at the top, you'll see that you have these different default sections here as well. This is where we use the chart of accounts from QuickBooks and set up in Knowify where we want to map certain things to. The initial process has us walk through these steps here: expenses and income, and if you're syncing time over to QuickBooks as well. This is all that's required to sync. I'm going to walk through how we can get into more detailed and get more granular with how we send information to QuickBooks, but at least when you're getting started, and this is another thing that we do walk through on the initial onboarding session, is setting up these company defaults. And it's pretty straightforward. Default expense account, and this is if we add items to a vendor invoice or to a expense. This will be the default expense account that we use here. And you should have choices here of your full chart of accounts, whether you use cost of goods sold or, expense accounts, however you want this set up. This will make sure that when we sync over these expenses, this is the account that we use for those items. Just below this is default payment account. And this is if you log the payment in Knowify for a vendor invoice, so us paying the vendor. You're able to choose one of your bank accounts here so that it will automatically send that payment to QuickBooks. This, again, is only going to be applied if you log the payment in Knowify. If you were to log the payment in QuickBooks, obviously you can select the account there. And in that case, Knowify doesn't need to be involved with that. We'll just pull in the payment amount to update the outstanding balance of the invoice. But any payments going from Knowify to QuickBooks will use this default here that you set. Very similar on the income side. We have, rather than choosing the account, we choose a default income service. And this is pretty much what this applies to is, you see here, the invoice I have here in QuickBooks under item. So it will have our description here. And this will be if we use our catalog items or our line items, schedule of values, however we set up our jobs. But this item column, that's where that income services comes into play. And I'll show you how we can get it set up so that we use a separate service for each line. But in most cases, we're just putting in a default so that if you didn't use an item that's already been set up, Knowify is going to default to whatever you have entered into this box. So in this example here, I have an invoice where my first line item is this Ruffin site prep. And this is not already set up as a product or a service in my catalog or in QuickBooks. So Knowify is going to use whatever the default is, which you can see here is set up as the QBD service. So I'll show you how we get more detailed with this, but again, QuickBooks requires that we just have these main company defaults set so that if we don't go into more detail, at least we have something to fall back on. The default payment account, same idea as with vendors. This is just for customer payments. So payments coming to us from our customers or GCs. This is the bank account that will credit the money towards. Again, only applies for payments logged in Knowify. You can log these payments in QuickBooks and choose your account there as well. Now, that's all that's required to sync. Once I have these set and we go through that initial connection, you're good to go to start sending and receiving data. If we want to get more detailed with this, I can go to expenses defaults, and this focuses in on my vendors. Actually, I'll start off here in the catalog defaults. I want to walk through the hierarchy of what we use and when. So catalog defaults section here, this is going to mirror your list that's shown in your catalog in Knowify and also your product and service list in QuickBooks. So you have a list of all of your products and services. And in this section, I can set a default account to use for each individual item. And that's where on that invoice example I pulled up, if we use these items throughout Knowify when we're creating our contracts, when we're creating our invoices or our expenses, then the first thing Knowify is going to check is if there's a catalog item used. And if there is, then we're going to use that account. So in this case, the first thing we did was check if there was a catalog item used. So out of these three, the first one was not a catalog item, but the next two, framing and demolition, were. So what we did was we chose the default account for each of these items. So if you use your catalog items, that's how you can get the most detail and sync to the most accounts on any given invoice or expense. As far as the hierarchy goes, this is the first thing that we check when we send something to QuickBooks, is the catalog defaults. Next thing we'll check is the income default or the expense defaults. The difference here is whether we're referring to a customer invoice, in which case we use income defaults, or the vendor invoice, in which case we use expenses defaults. And here, this is what we go to if a catalog item is not used. We will come in here and see if for your vendor, you set an account that differs from your main company defaults. So you can see I have a lot of blank ones here. This is completely optional. We already have the company defaults filled in here. So basically any vendor that these counts are going to be used, I can just leave blank and Knowify will refer to that. I'm only setting something here if the account or payment account is going to be different than that main company default. And that is the second thing that we check. First thing we check is if there's a catalog item. If there's not, we check to see if your vendor has a different account. Same thing on the customer side for invoices. We will check the catalog first, and then we will check each customer to make sure that there's not a different income service or payment account selected. And if both of those return false, we don't have a catalog item used, and there's not a separate default, that's when we refer back to these main company defaults. And that's why this is all that's required. But you can use these other sections to get as detailed as you need. And before we jump into an example, last part here is the job defaults. And this is for your classes. If you're using classes in QuickBooks, basically you can add a new job in Knowify. And whenever the job is added in Knowify, you'll be able to assign a class from QuickBooks to that job. So any invoice or expense logged onto this project will also carry over this class. So like I mentioned earlier, we don't manage the classes. You wouldn't be adding or editing them here in Knowify, but we do pull them in from QuickBooks so that you can assign them to a job just to make this process easier. All right, so I want to walk through an example here just to give you an idea how the sync works, both directions. So first, what I'm going to do is create a customer invoice here for a job that I know is already synced. And, forgive me for kind of going through this a little quick. I want to focus more on the QuickBooks part of it, but if you need any assistance with using Knowify, creating invoices, expenses, anything like that, don't hesitate to reach out. So I'm going to sync over this invoice, and you'll see that when we finalize the invoice, it gives us the option to sync to QuickBooks or not sync to QuickBooks. So if I wanted to keep it in Knowify only, when I come down and I customize my invoice, I can click the Send to QuickBooks box to uncheck it, and this will not sync it to QuickBooks. This will keep it in Knowify only. especially in a case where maybe you've already created this invoice in QuickBooks and you want to just backlog it in Knowify, bring Knowify up to speed without creating a duplicate. This would be a case of unchecking this box. But you can see that unless I actually go in and uncheck it, Knowify has this checked and ready so that once I finalize, it's going to send it to the queue. And that's my message up here in the top right. It lets me know that the transaction is eligible to be synced. It's in the queue. So the next time I initiate that sync to QuickBooks, we're going to send this invoice over. And let's also create a bill here. So I got one expense and one invoice. I'll go ahead and point it against that job as well. Same idea here with the bill. I'm going to verify and submit. Unless I uncheck this box, Knowify is going to send this directly to the queue. And you'll see it also very important here that once I create the bill and I create the invoice, we have this as an outstanding balance here. Because like I mentioned earlier, the payments can go in both directions. I can come in here and record a payment in Knowify, and this will sync to QuickBooks. Alternatively, and that's what I'll use the example for, we can log the payment in QuickBooks. Knowify will pull it in, we'll display it here, and we'll update the balance for you. So when I come back to my queue here, you can see that I now have my on hold. I have my invoice and my bill. It's ready to be synced. And I can actually initiate that right here by clicking Sync with QuickBooks. And again, this depends on the size of the QuickBooks file as far as how long it will take. But the first thing we do is check the connection, which we saw earlier is connected. And then it'll start pushing this information to QuickBooks. Now you can see on the QuickBooks side, I can come in here and I can see the invoice synced over with the same amount. I can see that it's for the correct job. So let's pull up this invoice here. You can see that it pulls in the exact job and the parent customer that I used to create this invoice for. I get the job information here as far as the job site address. When I create the invoice, I can always change the invoice date and number in Knowify. That'll carry over to QuickBooks, as well as the payment terms here as well. And we pretty much displayed the description here, exactly how you customize it in Knowify. And we went over earlier how to make sure that these services are using the correct ones. And I can record a payment here for this invoice as well. So I'll be able to see, run reports on this information here. And I can easily go back and forth between the invoice itself and the payment logged. So that's, again, a very common flow. You log the invoice in Knowify, sync it to QuickBooks, and then I come in here in QuickBooks and I record my payment. And when I initiate the sync from QuickBooks to Knowify, it's going to pull this payment in and update the balance of that invoice. So keeping things updated on both sides. Let's check back into Knowify. You can see that just a minute or so, it syncs everything over. So my invoice made it, my bill made it over, and I even get prompted if I want to input anything from QuickBooks into Knowify. You'll have two options whenever you do this. You'll be able to import the latest data. You can see that the number is higher as far as how long, because this checks everything. This is going to check any new customers, any new vendors, any new products and services, as well as any new payments. You have the option of instead doing a more expedited sync and just pulling in the recent payments. So like I know I logged the payment against my invoice. Maybe I'll do this once a day or once a week, but I'm going to import the recent payments a lot more often. So this will initiate the sync from QuickBooks to Knowify. And shortly I should see an entry in the log after it's done importing that lets me know that the invoice that I synced has now been marked as paid. So we can update that in Knowify. And I showed you where the invoice was in QuickBooks. We can also see where the bill is in QuickBooks as well, under this bill tracker here. Just sort this one by date. You can see that the bill that we just logged for 1,000 is now available to us here in QuickBooks. Also carries over the contract job, so I can actually see which job it was for here and run reports on this information. And I kind of skip past this a little quick, but you do have the ability to put in a date, an invoice number. The class should carry over if we've had that set up in the job defaults. So again, it tries to bring over the bill from Knowify to QuickBooks, but also fill in all of the relevant information here. So all you're doing is just running your accounting in QuickBooks. All right, and let's just check back into Knowify and see if we got that payment from QuickBooks. All right, perfect. So now you can see that the import of data is complete. So it only takes a couple minutes when we're just checking for payments. Again, anytime you want to initiate a sync, you can click this sync with QuickBooks here, and this will give you the option to pull a little bit of everything from QuickBooks or just the payments for bills and invoices. You can see in this case, our log is updated to see that we have this invoice payment logged in QuickBooks, pulled into Knowify. And then I can always pop into the job and invoice in Knowify, and I can see that, you know, we created this here, it's synced, it's revenue for the job, and it's now closed because it's been marked as fully paid. I have meant payment pulled in from QuickBooks. Any kind of details I entered in QuickBooks will carry over. And this is just how we can keep the books updated in QuickBooks and you know, our financials in Knowify updated as well in real time. And that is the basics that I wanted to cover, at least on this session here. Like I mentioned, and I can't stress this enough, we do walk through this process with you as far as setting it up. So we will help you out with the connection. We will make sure, run a test that it works while you're on the line, and set up your defaults so that after our first initial onboarding session, you know, you're confident in the sync and you're all set to go. At that point, all that it takes is just making sure that we're running our Knowify sync agent up in the background. You know, this is what we use to send and receive data. You'll see the status here if you ever have this thing up. It will let us know that we're checking for new clients, pulling payments, and doing all of that, etc. At this point, I have some time here we left for questions. So if you have any questions, please submit them in the Q&A, and do my best to go over as many as I can with as much information as possible. I'm going to go ahead and see that we have a question here already. Let's see, does the sync require a dedicated user account on the QuickBooks side? So very good question here. When you initially make the connection, yes, you need to have the administrator logged in single user mode. That's a requirement to make the connection. After that, you don't have to be the admin in single user mode in order for the sync to work. Basically, you want to install this sync agent to be on any whatever computer or server or remote desktop that you have QuickBooks on. And the sync agent should be, you know, stored in the same place as the QuickBooks file. As long as that is the case, you can use multi-user mode. You can have somebody other than the admin logged into QuickBooks, and you'll still be able to initiate the sync on the Knowify side. So more so the dedicated, the admin user is really designed for the initial integration to authorize to send and receive data. But other than that, going forward, the main thing is that the sync agent is running and it's on the same place that you have the QuickBooks file. Let's see, I got one more question in here. If we have an existing instance of Knowify initially set up to work with QBO, do we need to start over for QBD? Another great question. So what happens is when you make the connection with QuickBooks, even for the online version, we use IDs so that we can map over. So when we do sync something, we know where to sync it. So every customer, vendor, invoice, expense, anything you create that's eligible to sync now has an ID. If you change the QuickBooks account, whether it's switching to a different online account or switching to QuickBooks Desktop, those IDs no longer match. And especially when you're using the jobs as subclients, it gets a little tricky trying to manually map those IDs on the back end so that we can avoid sync errors. It's likely a rocky process. So if you're switching from QBO to QBD, we would need to start you off with a new Knowify account, but this doesn't mean that you lose everything that you have. Basically, we would set you up with a new Knowify account, transfer your subscription there, and then we would keep your old Knowify account open for archive data and for any jobs that you still need to backlog or finish. So we would keep both accounts active for as long as you need, and you would still only just pay for the one subscription. But that's the only way that we can guarantee a clean sync. We just want to make sure that you don't struggle with the integration when you're getting started. So yeah, we would start you with a new Knowify account to sync with QuickBooks Desktop, but your old Knowify account would stay open, and we would give you access to it for as long as you need to keep track of the old information. All right, appreciate everybody taking out the time today. If you have any other questions or need any more information about the desktop integration, again, please don't hesitate to reach out, and we're happy to help. Thanks again, and have a great rest of your day.